Time again for another installment of The Basics, and on today's show I want to talk about a lost art in regards to CCGs, and that is the test session. Now, back when I first started playing CCGs, and this was especially true with both Magic and the Star Trek CCG, is that me and my friends at the time would play test sessions. And I'm going to explain to you today how that works and why you should still use these test sessions. Now, the 1990s, especially the late 90s, were a different time for CCGs because most of the main CCGs that we talk about today were still active. They were still being produced by their respective companies, the exception of Magic the Gathering, which is still going. And every new expansion that came out for a lot of these CCGs would bring new card types and new rules. And anyone who tried to build a deck and go right into competitive gameplay at that point was at a huge disadvantage, whether playing with friends or going straight into a tournament, because there was always somebody out there that had a better handle on the rules and had more of the new cards. What my friends and I started doing, my CCG group, when a new expansion came out for one of the CCGs, we would have a test session. We would earmark a day every couple months, and depending on who would be hosting it at their house, in which we would take some of the new cards and new rules, build a deck, and there would be no competitive play, no points, no whatever, depending on the game. In effect of the Star Trek CCG, we started doing this when the Q Continuum came out because it introduced a new type of card, which was the Q Event, Q Dilemma, and Q Interrupt, but also the big thing was the Q's 10th side deck. This was the first time an actual side deck came out for the game. So about a month after the expansion came out, when we all had enough of the cards in our collection by then to use a side deck, we would have a test session where we'd play a 2 or 3 player game and just test the side deck and cards coming out and downloading and whatnot and see how they affected gameplay. There would be no solving missions for points. We would move up and down the space line as if we were attempting missions, and then we'd go from there. Test sessions in this game were also useful for figuring out combinations of dilemmas that worked. And of course you'd have to switch it up after every game and then use your best judgment after that so that you'd have a different combo ready for when you did play competitively. But this was something that you needed to do. You can't just decide what dilemmas worked well with others and go from there. Another facet of the test session was seeing what personnel worked well with the deck in terms of completing missions and passing said dilemmas, as well as what personnel on what ship and the strategy used for going down the space line and attempting the missions. Moving over to Magic the Gathering, the test sessions we did with this game were a little bit more involved, mainly because there's a lot more going on in the Magic card game in a sense of creatures, instants, artifacts, mana. So one thing we would do with test sessions is we would switch up the amount of mana in a deck. Now, I've mentioned before that 30 to 35% is your sweet spot, but we experimented with as little as 20%, as much as 50% to get a handle on what that would do. Because we were not playing competitively, we were able to determine where in the game we would go wrong, how the deck would work, if the mana was too much, what it would do, and it would help us learn for when we did play competitively. We'd also use these sessions for testing out the amount of creatures and the type of creatures and how much it costs to bring those creatures out in the game. The final thing that came out of the test sessions were artifacts, because these are a huge part of Magic the Gathering. And sometimes trying to balance your artifacts in any given deck is painful, no matter what expansion came out and what cards came out. So we would experiment with artifacts and artifact creatures and see what triplets or quads did what in terms of artifacts and which ones we'd prefer in a deck. Test sessions are useful. They're still useful to this day. If you do not utilize test sessions with your friends, I urge you to give them a shot. One of the biggest issues with CCGs since they first came out is that hardly any players give enough thought to maybe seeing what does what before going into actual competitive gameplay. no one just takes a step back and goes, hey, what if I can get a couple friends of mine to play a non-competitive game and we can just mess around with it and see what that does and learn from either the mistakes or maybe some of the things that go right in the game and go from there. A test session is a perfect way to get the feel of the game and to figure out what does what. And it also helps new players. And as I've said before on this show, we need more new players in each game and taking up the old sets of cards and playing. And there's no better way to help them out than with a test session. Don't play competitively all the time. Don't try to rip off your other player. Just have some fun. That's all for today.